Sego, skanagoga, yonadea was yundats, wagatahuni dana kanyangahaga. Greetings. I hope you are at peace today. And my name is Yonadaewas. That's my Mohawk name. My English name is Kay Olan. I am Kanyangahaga, which is the real way to say that I am Mohawk. And I am of the Wolf Clan. And I was asked today to share a couple of stories with you that relate to this time of year. And when I say our stories, when I say our anything like that, I'm talking about the Haudenosaunee. And just to quickly explain who we are so that there's no misunderstanding, this is a replica of a wampum belt. We have many, many different wampum belts. And these help us to record our history and important events and treaties. And this one talks about how long ago the Kanyangahaga or the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca nations unified into a peace confederacy, into a peace league. And some people call that the Five Nations because this represents those five nations that were warring, but then were successful in unifying into a peace league. The five nations are the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Later on in the 1700s, the Tuscarora people came up from the Carolinas, North Carolina, to join. And so some people call this the Six Nations. Some people refer to it as the Iroquois or Iroquois Confederacy, but we call it the Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee. If you're Mohawk or Oneida, you say Haudenosaunee. If you're Onondaga, Cayuga, or Seneca, you say Haudenosaunee. And that means the people of the Longhouse, the people who built the longhouses. We used to live in long bark-covered houses. But it also symbolizes the unification of those warring nations into a peace confederacy. And so when you hear Five Nations, Six Nations, Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, Haudenosaunee, there are different names referring to that same unified group of nations that was seeking peace and that still exists today. And so the stories that I'm going to share with you come from those people. And these are very old stories, the ones that I'm going to share with you today. The first one is one that's very appropriate for this time of year. And it talks about how long, long ago, the Ungwa, the people, the human beings, the real people, were given instructions, their original instructions as to how to live here on Mother Earth. And they were taught to give thanks every day for all of the gifts that we have been given. And in so doing, we would never take those gifts for granted. And over time, we were taught ceremonies and songs and dances to help us remember those teachings and to help us show our gratitude for being alive and for having everything that we need to sustain life. We also were told to keep a good mind in everything that we're doing, to work with one another with love and with compassion. And we were also taught to remember that we are part of a giant web of life. We're not above it. We're not separate from it. We're not below it. We're part of it. And so we are connected to every part of the natural world and should not take the natural world or any part of the natural world for granted. And so that again ties in with us giving thanks each day for every part of the natural world. And so we were given those instructions, and we were also taught to take what we need from the natural world, but not to waste anything, because we need to think 7 generations into the future. We need to consider the effects of our words and actions on the coming generations, on our children, our grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren, and so on. And so this story has to do with all of that. Long, long ago, there was a village. And in that village, the people worked hard to provide a home for their families, to provide food for their families, and clothing, and all of the necessities that they would need to survive. But people being people, human beings being human people, human beings being human, we forget sometimes what our most important instructions are, what our most important duties are. And so these people in that village were working very hard, but they also were forgetting to give thanks each day for the gifts that they were given. They were getting kind of lazy in terms of having their ceremonies so that they could express their gratitude together. And eventually they weren't having their ceremonies at all, and they weren't teaching their young people to the values that they had been taught. And the young people in that village, they had food, they had clothing, they had shelter, but they felt as though they were missing something. Something wasn't there that they needed. And it came to be that a group of them would go into the forest, and they would meet with an older boy in the forest. And this older boy, he remembered what his grandfather had taught him about how to give thanks and how to sing the songs and do the dances and have ceremonies. And he would teach these young children what he remembered that his grandfather had taught him. And the boys felt very good about this. They felt as though this was filling the void that they were feeling in their hearts and in their minds, because they knew something was missing. And one day the boys met with that older boy, and their leader, the older boy, he said, "We really should have a feast to give thanks. Why don't you go home and ask your families if you could have some food to bring to the feast?" And so the boys were very excited. They couldn't wait for this to happen. They went home and asked their mothers and fathers if they could have that food for a feast in the forest. And their parents said, no, you can eat your food here. We have plenty here. You don't need to go into the forest to eat. And besides, some of that food might get wasted. You might drop it on the way. And, we don't want to waste any food. So no, they wouldn't give them the food. And the boys were very disappointed. And they went back into the forest and told their leader what had happened. And he said, well, that's okay. We'll have our celebration, our ceremony anyway. And he started to play his water drum and sing a song. And he taught the boys how to do a certain dance. And he said, when you're doing this dance, don't stop for anything. And no matter what, don't look down. And so the boys started to dance. And they danced. And the more they danced, the lighter their hearts felt, and the lighter their feet felt. And they could feel themselves rising up into the air. They felt that light, and it felt good. They felt as though they were really doing something that was meaningful. And they rose higher and higher into the air, into the sky. Well, in the meantime, their parents back in the village realized that the children were missing and they were worried. So they went into the forest to look for them. And they could hear drumming and they followed the sound of the drumming and they came to the spot where they looked up and they saw their children way up in the sky dancing. And they were frightened. They were amazed, but they were frightened. And so they called to their children to come back. But the children remembered what they were told, not to look down. And so they kept dancing and dancing, and they went higher and higher, except for one boy. One boy, he heard his grandmother calling to him, and he loved his grandmother so much that he felt bad. He missed her, and he looked down, but when he did that, he fell. He turned into a shooting star, and he fell to Mother Earth. And he landed so hard, he disappeared into Mother Earth. The other boys, they kept dancing and they became the stars in the sky. Well, the following spring, that spring, where that one boy fell, there was a sprout that grew. It was a small maple tree. It was a sugar maple tree. And over the years, it got bigger and bigger. And finally, it was big enough that it could be tapped. And the people could take maple sap from that tree. And it was very, very sweet. And that reminded them of the love that that grandmother and that boy had shared. Well, at this time of year, when we look up into the sky at night, we see after we experience the new moon at this time around January, February. It's not always the same time. And 5 days after the new moon is when we see a group of stars that are referred to as the Pleiades. And that's when they're the highest in the sky. And they remind us of the dancers. We call them the 7 dancers. And that reminds us when we see them to tell this story and that it is time for us to have our midwinter ceremonies where we renew ourselves and we atone for everything from the past year and look forward to all of the wonderful things that will happen in the coming year. We prepare ourselves for that. It's our time of renewal. And when we do that, we remember that we have a responsibility to our young people, not just to feed them, not just to clothe them, not just to give them shelter, but to also feed them spiritually and spend time with them, teaching them about the values that we have been taught, about who we are and from where we have come, so that they can better know who they are and where they are going. And so we need to remember to feed our children physically and spiritually, both. And that's how that story goes. Now, there are other versions of this story, but they all share some similarities in their teachings and some similarities in their connections with the natural world. So different storytellers tell it in a slightly different way, but that's the way that I was taught it. And that's the way that I have learned a little bit more about who we are and what our responsibilities are. Another story that I'd like to share with you is also an old story and apropos to this time of year, because right now, here we are in winter and we're thinking about spring. We're thinking about when the days are going to get longer, when the weather will get warmer, when the birds will return, when the trees will wake up. We're thinking about all of those things that are part of this cycle of life, everything that has happened in the winter, everything that's going to happen in the spring and the summer and later on in the fall. long time ago, the Creator came to Mother Earth to see how things were going. He came to a certain village. And when he got there, he looked around and he noticed that the longhouses were in disrepair. It seemed as though nobody was taking the time to take care of them and make them as weatherproof and protective as they should be. He looked at the gardens and he noticed that there were weeds in the gardens. And again, it didn't look like anybody was taking care of them, the gardens, the way they should. Everything was in disarray. And he noticed that there was nobody home. There was nobody in the village, no men, no women, no children. And he wondered where they were and he wondered what they were doing. And as he walked around, he heard a sound in the distance. It was almost like a moaning sound, but it didn't sound like anybody was hurt. And so he followed that sound. And he came to a grove of sugar maple trees. And by now, that sound he had heard had grown louder, and he realized where it was coming from, because at the foot of each tree, there was a person, a man or a woman or a child. And the people, they weren't standing, they weren't sitting, they were all lying down on their backs. And they had their eyes closed and they had their mouths wide open. And they were making those sounds like they were enjoying something. And then he noticed that they had made holes in the maple trees. They had tapped the maple trees. And there was syrup coming out of the trees and down, dripping down into the mouths of the people that were laying down underneath the trees. In those days, the syrup came out of the maple trees as syrup, not the way it comes out of the trees these days. And the people were drinking that maple syrup right from the trees, and they were really enjoying it. And they didn't even notice that the Creator was there. Their eyes were still closed, and they were just busy drinking. And the Creator noticed that they didn't look like they were in good shape. It looked like they were disheveled and dirty, that they hadn't been taking care of themselves. They even looked like they hadn't done a whole lot of work recently. They looked out of shape. And so the Creator thought to himself, this isn't good. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. The people, they're supposed to enjoy the maple syrup, but not all the time and not all day and not every day. And they're not supposed to neglect all of their responsibilities just to drink this delicious maple syrup. And so he went to a birch tree and he took the bark from that birch tree and he made a very large basket. And then he took that basket to a nearby creek and he dipped that basket into the creek and filled it with water. And then he went to the maple trees and he poured water into the tops of each of the maple trees. And he finally, when he was done, the people noticed that there was a difference. It seemed as though the maple syrup didn't taste the same anymore. And they were surprised and they were confused. And so they opened their eyes and they sat up and they saw the Creator. And the Creator said, "Oh, you have forgotten to be grateful for this gift of the maple syrup. You have neglected everything that you were supposed to do just to feed yourselves with this delicious syrup. And so I've done something to help you remember to appreciate that gift and to also remember what your responsibilities are. I've diluted that syrup with water. And so for now on, you're not going to be able to take that sap from the trees, the maple trees, except in the spring. When the sap starts to rise in the maple trees in the spring, then you can tap those trees and you will get what we call sweet water, which is very good for you and it tastes good, but it's not like maple syrup. If you want that maple syrup, you're going to have to take that sweet water after you give thanks to it. And you will have to cook it and cook it and cook it and cook it so that the water evaporates out. You'll have to take 40 gallons of that sap to make just 1 gallon of maple syrup. And you can only do it in the springtime. And this way, you will still be able to enjoy that gift, but you will not guzzle it down. Instead, you will use it sparingly, be grateful for it, treat it with respect, and you will also make the time to take care of your families and your neighbors and your village and not forget your responsibilities to help your families and yourselves. And so that's the story of the maple trees. And that's how that story goes. So many of our stories explain why things are the way they are in nature, but they also, many of those stories have lessons that they teach us about how we should live our lives and how we should interact with one another as human beings and how we should interact with Mother Nature because we are all related. Yawagoa, thank you for listening.